Hey guys, I'm just about to leave to go see Dune Part 2 in theaters, but before I head out, wanted to give you guys my expectations and anticipation for the film. Now, I'm definitely looking forward to this. Denis Villeneuve is one of my favorite directors, mainly because of Blade Runner 2049, but his directing has been very consistent. With Arrival and even Sicario, that's a movie that the subject matter isn't something that really appeals to me. The movie was really good and enhanced by the directing that really increased the tension throughout the film. I'm also a pretty big fan of Dune, and seeing the first movie, just the world and all the concepts, how they're portrayed on screen, including things like the voice, was really interesting. And I will say, I felt like the second half, the pacing did drag a bit, which I know is a common complaint. But overall, I still really enjoyed the film because of the visuals and the directing of it. So, Dune Part 2, really looking forward to. I think again the visuals are going to be really good, and I feel like the pacing is going to be. I kind of feel like it's not going to be perfect, but I feel like it's going to be better than the first one was. So really looking forward to it. I think it's going to be great, and so we'll come back and see if I was correct. And for additional context, I've read both the original Dune novel and the sequel, Dune Messiah, and so I'm familiar with the story overall. It's been a few years since I read it, so I couldn't map out the entire plot for you, but I am aware of the overarching stories, the broad strokes of it. Alright, I've now seen Dune Part 2, but don't worry, I'm not going to mention any spoilers or things that I wouldn't want to know myself before seeing the movie until after a very clear warning. Now, this movie, I went into it with pretty high expectations, but I still walked away impressed. And I will say my predictions were pretty much accurate. The visuals were great, and I really enjoyed the movie overall. And the pacing, I'll say it's definitely better than the first one. I felt like it really wasn't much of an issue. There are some scenes that feel a little rushed just because there's so much to the movie. But I think complaining that a movie that was 2 hours and 46 minutes and is part two of one book wasn't long enough is a promising sign that the movie was great. Now, the visuals, even with the muted color palette of a planet that's all sand and all desert, there's still really good compositions of shots, and I felt like there was enough variety. That didn't feel like you've seen Arrakis and then you just see the same thing for the rest of the film. They have a good variety to it, and there's plenty of stuff to make it interesting that it doesn't feel like, oh, I've seen everything already, like 10 minutes into it. And in regards to the pacing, the first one, the ending, it kind of drags a bit. That was a common complaint. I felt like this movie, there wasn't really any scenes that I was like, oh, this is going on too long, or it felt like there was a scene that just had to dump a lot of exposition to keep the movie going. I felt like overall they did a good job of conveying info to the viewer, and it wasn't something that's like you understand it if you read the book. It's like you can go into it, just focus and be engaged with the film. I think everything will make sense. Now, I feel like that might be a little ambitious, but I don't feel like people are going to be leaving the theater confused as to what was going on. And this movie, like, is well executed across the board because there's so many, like, unique concepts to the Dune book that's so daunting to translate to film. But I feel like Denis Villeneuve really did a great job of doing that. And it didn't feel like they kind of scaled it back a little bit or, like, played it safe to make sure that they're not doing anything that's too out there. I feel like they really committed to the vision of the novel and did a good job following through with it. But I will say, if you go into this movie and you're kind of coming to mock or looking for things to laugh at, there's a few shots I can think of that, if you're not invested in or like bought into the world of Dune, could be pretty comedic out of context. But I feel like I would definitely prefer that rather than the movie, the people making the movie go like, well, I don't want to risk the potential of someone laughing at it, so let's play it safe and just kind of tone everything down. But I feel like overall is really well executed. I'm glad that they really committed to it. Because if I talked to someone before seeing the movie and was like, "Oh, you saw Dune Part 2? Like, was it kind of weird?" And they're like, "Nah, it was pretty normal." I'd be like, "I don't know if you saw Dune then." So I'm really glad that they committed to it and they did a good job following through on it. So obviously, I really enjoyed the movie. I would definitely recommend seeing it. If you saw the first one and you liked it, I think you'll really enjoy part two. And if you didn't like the first one so much, I feel like the premise of it, if that didn't really work for you, I feel like this is still on the same planet. It's not going to be drastically different. That's going to win over more people. But if you saw the first one, you're like, oh, it's good, except like the third act, it's kind of slow. I feel like this one is going to be a lot better. So overall, it's really good. But to touch on some negatives, just to kind of try to balance things out, one thing I will say is that similar to how in the first movie Zendaya was pretty heavily advertised and then was not in the movie for very long and only at the end, I think I could see somewhat similar complaints about Florence Pugh and Christopher Walken in this film. That it's definitely not as much of the same degree. They're shown kind of sprinkled throughout the film, but again, it's something that their total runtime is not very extensive. So if you go into this movie and you're like, I'll see it because I love Florence Pugh and Christopher Walken, I don't think it's going to be enough of them to win you over. But I wouldn't change that. I feel like the only way they can really fix the problem is to either change the story of the book that they're adapting, which I feel like is not the right way to go, or to get less notable actors in those roles so people aren't disappointed that they weren't featured more. But I feel like both of those approaches are just limiting the film, and so I'm glad that they didn't make those compromises. Overall, I think it's pretty clear. Really enjoyed the movie, would definitely recommend. And I feel like the pacing, like I said, it's a bit tighter than the first movie. They have enough variety. It is still a very long movie, so it's not going to feel like, oh, that was 2 hours, 46 minutes. It felt like 90 minutes. It's still going to be pretty long, but I don't feel like it's going to be boring or that there's stretches of the movie that not a lot happens. But I will say, if you bring your kids to see the movie, I feel like it's a bit iffy if they're going to enjoy it. But I don't imagine too many people are going to be going to see Dune Part 2 without having seen the first one. And so, with Dune Part 2 feeling like an improved overall package compared to the first one, then I feel like it's pretty safe to say whether you'll enjoy this one or not. Now, that's about all I want to say about the movie before going into deeper territory that I maybe would prefer not to have known before seeing it. And not even just necessarily spoilers of big plot points, but just things that I would want to keep as surprise for myself. So, this is going to be your spoiler warning. I can only fend them off for so long. So, now's your moment, your opportunity to back out before I continue saying more about the film. All right, let's get into it. Now that I can talk about the movie as a whole, I have to talk about that awesome scene where it's fighting under the black sun. That whole arena scene where Austin Butler's character is fighting the three remaining Atreides people, where everything's just grayscale. I love it when a movie has a scene that's just visually so distinct from the rest of the film that you could take any frame from it and be like, oh yeah, that's that scene. I really liked Austin Butler's character in the film. I feel like it's really tough to make someone seem more intimidating than Dave Bautista, but even though he has a smaller stature than him, the way that he almost seems more beast-like and ruthless helps sell that. And the scene where he beats up Dave Bautista and like makes him kiss his shoe definitely helps sell that pretty quickly. But I feel like they did show us rather than just telling us that. Like the way he acts during the battle and his character being introduced, like licking the blade, I think definitely helps set him up as someone that's a bit more unhinged than Dave Bautista. But that whole scene that shows the Harkonnen homeworld, everything looks so cool. I feel like it's tough to make a faction that's entirely bald people with no eyebrows look cool or intimidating, but they really nailed it. And on top of that, also the fireworks that just look like ink blots when they go off was really cool and something that I hadn't seen in a movie before. One other thing that I really liked the visuals of was the Emperor's ship just being like this chrome sphere. In that shot where it's flying over the planet and you just see the sand of Arrakis reflected on it looked really cool. And even that action scene at the beginning where it's the Harkonnens walking up and then they climb up the rocks to get away from the sandworms, that shot of them like floating up the rocks and it's almost like they're doing a spacewalk, and then contrasted when they get sniped and their bodies are like tumbling to the ground so heavily. I really like the way that's portrayed in this movie. That always feels like the Harkonnens have so many more resources and firepower than the Fremen, but the Fremen are able to fight back by using the desert to their advantage and ambushing them. And I think that's well established in the scene where they're attacking the spice harvester. And it starts with this black fin sticking out of the sand, but those are their breathing tubes. And then the harvester's like about to run them over, and you just see people running out of the sand and then taking them out. And I feel like everything in that scene is like so distinctly Dune that there's the ornithopter firing down at them, but it's not just like, oh, it's like it's basically a helicopter, but it looks like an ornithopter, and it has a gun, so it basically fires like a machine gun. Like the way the gun fires, where it's like a circle pattern, I feel like helps make it unique and easily recognizable as like, oh, that's something from Dune, rather than just like, oh, it's like anything from any other action movie. And so the rest of the scene, I also felt like it was executed well, where they're trying to take out the ornithopter, and the moment they do, they kind of like free up the other people to take down the actual harvester. And the way that's like this big battle to get rid of that ornithopter to take pressure off of everyone else. And as soon as they do, you see the lasers like slicing through the harvester so easily. It was really cool. And so I really feel like that scene was just like really good from beginning to end. The costume design in this movie is really good. What makes me think of it is the people with the crescent hats in the background in the arena fight scene was really cool. But across the board, like everything looks so distinct and different, but unique to the world of Dune, and really enhances the experience. Especially all the Jene Besseret women that have the like tall hats and stuff like that. But also like Florence Pugh's character throughout the movie having all these different outfits that are so a bit weird, but really work for the film. And one thing I really liked about the costume design of the movie is the way that Paul Atreides' mom, as she's trying to get more embedded into the culture of the Fremen and become more of a religious figure, as the movie goes on, it feels like there's this transformation with her that's like every time we see her again, she's kind of like more grandiose almost. Like at first, the movie begins with her in the still suit and pretty basic, and then she becomes the Reverend Mother. The next time you see her, she has the writing on her face, and then the next time she has like a headdress on, and it's not too big, but still looks more ornate and like she's getting more prominent in the religious side of the Fremen. And then she has that whole like headdress on, and so I just really like that as the movie went on, you know her goal is to become like a religious authority with the Fremen. And every time you see her, it just feels like she's evolving. Like her silhouette is like growing larger throughout the film as she becomes more embedded with them. And so I just really like that aspect of the visual storytelling. And on that note, I did also like that once Paul Atreides drinks the water of life and starts becoming a bit darker and a little more sinister, like his motives are a lot more questionable, he starts to wear black a lot more prominently. So at the first scene where he's talking with the mom about him knowing that they're Harkonnens, you see him and he's like basically wearing a black cape, and then throughout the rest of the movie you kind of see more black clothing associated with him, and just kind of adds a visual to let you know that his decisions is becoming a little more evil. Now to talk more specifically about the pacing of the film, like I said, I think overall the pacing of the film was pretty tight and a lot better than the previous film. Like, it didn't have a scene that dragged on too long, but there were some scenes that felt a little fast. The first scene I can think of is when Dave Bautista is leading an attack on the Fremen, and they land, they go in there, they get picked off one by one, and then he retreats. And that part where the Fremen actually turns out to be on the ramp of the plane of the Ornithopter fighting him, that scene was pretty cool, but it did feel a little fast. And I felt like it still justified being there. That I didn't feel like it needed to have to be exposition to be included. But later on, the scene where Austin Butler basically comes in to replace Dave Bautista, that scene did a good job showcasing that Dave Bautista isn't exactly getting the results that they're looking for. That pushes them to bring in Austin Butler. But even without that, I felt like that scene was good enough to be included on its own. But it did just feel a little bit fast. But later on in the film, near the end of the movie, I started to feel like there were a few scenes that just kind of felt like they're a bit fast. Like, I would have appreciated if we slowed down and got to spend more time with it. But I also understand the movie's 2 hours, 46 minutes, and it's part two of a movie, but I still want more. And the scene that I can think of that seems the most rushed was where Josh Brolin's character, Gurney Halleck, kills off Dave Bautista's character, the Beast Raven. And that scene, you know, you see Gurney fighting through people, like fighting through the army, and then walks up the hill to fight Dave Bautista. But that whole battle between them is pretty fast. It's basically just him stabbing him in the throat and giving two lines. And it just kind of felt like it was included to be like, oh, by the way, Gurney killed Beast Raven, and the movie carries on. But I felt like I would have liked that scene to be able to sit in that a little bit longer, to have more of that anticipation and knowing that he's going for revenge and stuff like that, rather than it just kind of be like, oh, by the way, here it is, that happened. All right, let's move on. Another scene that just kind of felt a bit fast, given all of the buildup and the meaning of the scene, was when Paul Atreides and the Fremen attack the Emperor's base. So they send in the atomic missiles and they ride in on sandworms, which is a really cool visual. And then it kind of just cuts to Paul Atreides walking in and then stabbing the Baron. Which in that moment, when he walks up to him, I was like, oh, the previous scene, like he was talking about how he knows that they're Harkonnens and that's the way to victory and stuff like that. So when he walked up, I was like, oh, he's gonna like team up with the Baron and they're kind of gonna start working together moving forward. And he goes, grandfather. I was like, oh, called it. And then he like just stabs him in the neck anyway. I was like, okay, that was wrong, but I'm kind of glad to be wrong. That was pretty cool. But that whole scene, like there was so much build up. Like the entire first movie was basically building up to that scene and all these attempts to kill the Baron. And then the scene where it actually happens, it just kind of felt a little fast. And then they just like head out. But definitely didn't ruin the movie by any means. Just something that was slightly disappointing. And my last minor issue with the movie is that I felt like it was held back slightly by the PG-13 rating. And I'm not someone that thinks adding blood and gore to every movie automatically makes it better. It definitely depends on the tone and theme of the film, but I felt like there were some scenes that it felt like they would have done more if they could. And the main example I can think of is the scene at the beginning, the first action scene, when Paul's mom smashes the Harkonnen's helmet with a rock and then smashes again, but they don't show anything. And throughout the movie, there's a lot of fights with knives and slashes, but it's just kind of cuts and there's no blood. And at the end of the movie, when Paul Atreides is fighting Austin Butler's character, Paul grabs the knife and he can see it slide through his hand, but there's no blood on it. I kind of felt like that would have added some intensity to the scene and would have been appropriate. But it also could have been that his gloves protected his hand, but it just felt like something that was maybe because of the PG-13 rating that it was this way. But they still show blade on knives at other points, so it's not like everything's completely clean. So that just about wraps up my thoughts on Dune Part 2. I really love the film and hope that we get to see more. And Denis Villeneuve's interpretation of this classic sci fi novel that's so difficult to adapt to film, but he nails it, is really impressive to see, especially after Blade Runner 2049. And so hopefully we get to see more, but either way, I'm really looking forward to whatever movie he works on next. If you don't want to know like the theme and reception to Dune Messiah, the book, and you just want to be completely blind to that, then go ahead and skip this part and we'll go to another wrap up conclusion outro. But Dune Messiah, the book, the reception to it, a lot of fans aren't really into it because a big theme of the book is that Dune kind of sets up Paul Atreides as this like figure, this legend that is really worshipped and a figurehead for the Fremen, and everyone praises him. And then Dune Messiah kind of reverses that and shows the dark sides and the problems that he's caused and that he's a bad person. And so coming off of Dune, where you're a big fan of this character and the next one just kind of really drags him through the mud, I can definitely see why people aren't really into it, but that's kind of the intent, was that you see the dark side of this character that you liked and were cheering for. And so I feel like the way the movie ended, I felt like they kind of anticipated that or tried to tamper expectations. That rather than ending the movie that's like, oh, look at Paul Atreides, he's such a good guy, such a great leader, did all these amazing things, they kind of hint or like indicate that there's a more sinister side to him once he takes the water of life, the way he starts acting afterwards, questionable motives he has for the rest of the movie, that he says he can see the future and he's doing the best possible outcome, but then he says he's going to marry the emperor's daughter instead of Zendaya and stuff like that. Already starts to make you question his motives and if he's actually a good person, and especially the way that he was so hesitant to go to the south, get all this power because of how it would corrupt him, and now it seems like he's really embracing that and doesn't seem too concerned about the repercussions. I feel like they are definitely planning to do a Dune Messiah adaptation, and this was just kind of a way to try to smooth over that transition that the books didn't do so well. And so, either way, really hope that we get more Dune as long as it's headed by Denis Villeneuve. And so, looking forward to it. We'll see what happens, but I'll definitely be there if it comes. And any other movie Denis Villeneuve makes next, I'll definitely be interested in seeing. That's going to wrap it up for this review. I really love the film, and I didn't want the whole review to just be me fanboying over it and ignoring any faults that it had. So I wanted to be sure to include any minor criticisms I had with the movie. But overall, this is a very impressive film and definitely one that I feel like is going to be a classic in the future. And like I said, if you really enjoyed the first one, I think you're going to love the second one because I certainly did. So, if you want to stay tuned for any future movie reviews, feel free to subscribe. By the way, thanks for watching. I truly appreciate it. I'll see you guys next time.